Cruise ships promise luxury, buffets, pools, endless leisure. But beneath the glamour lies a darker reality the industry hides. In this video, we're uncovering 6 of the most horrifying cruise ship deaths ever recorded. Massive vessels becoming floating nightmares in an instant. It was June 17, 2016, in Miami, Florida. The Carnival Victory was docked, its decks being cleaned and restocked before passengers boarded the next voyage. Deep below the bustling upper decks, a routine maintenance task was being carried out, one that would end with a tragedy few outside the crew would ever hear about. Carlos Mendez, 35, was a maintenance technician from Honduras. He had worked on cruise ships for 6 years, known among colleagues as dependable and careful, often taking the shifts others avoided. He lived frugally while aboard, sending most of his pay home to his wife and 2 children. Though the job was dangerous at times, he accepted the risks because it provided more stability than anything he could find back home. Friends described him as disciplined and modest, someone who rarely complained even when the work was exhausting. On a cruise liner, elevators are critical, not just for passengers, but for the crew moving supplies through hidden service corridors. Carlos specialized in mechanical systems, and over time he became the one others turned to when problems arose. Cruise ship elevators are different from land-based ones. Compact shafts, narrow access points, and constant strain from heavy daily use. That afternoon, a crew-only elevator had been reported faulty, and Carlos was assigned alongside 2 co-workers to repair it. The task seemed routine, but there were warning signs. The brake system on the elevator had been reported before, and though partial fixes were made, the replacement parts had not yet arrived. Official procedure required full lockout-tagout before anyone entered the shaft, but schedules were tight. The men decided to proceed, planning only a quick alignment check while the ship was docked. Carlos stepped into the shaft while his colleagues monitored above. He had done this dozens of times before. For a few minutes, everything was steady. Carlos crouched, inspecting the guide rails. Then, with no warning, the elevator car above shuddered and slipped. His co-workers shouted, but the gap was too narrow for him to escape. In seconds, the car dropped downward. Carlos turned as if to push away, but it was too late. The heavy steel slammed him against the shaft wall with crushing force. Witnesses later described the scene in grim detail. His lower body remained visible while his torso was pinned, blood pooling on the steel floor. His co-workers hit the emergency stop, but the damage was already fatal. Medical staff, called by the other workers, arrived within minutes, yet there was nothing they could do. His body was carefully removed and prepared for repatriation. Carnival covered funeral expenses, arranging transport back to Honduras. His family held a closed casket service, attended by neighbors and relatives who remembered him as a man who sacrificed for his family. The Coast Guard investigated, citing mechanical failure compounded by lapses in safety procedure. The report recommended stricter adherence to lockout-tagout rules. It was April 12, 2017, off the coast of Cozumel, Mexico. The Royal Caribbean ship Freedom of the Seas had anchored just offshore, the morning sun bright on calm water. Hundreds of passengers lined up to disembark for their day in port, unaware that the routine tendering process would end in irreversible tragedy. Sharon Hayes, 54, from San Antonio, was among them. A middle school teacher for nearly 3 decades, she was respected for her patience and practicality. She was not an adventurous traveler. Her life centered on family, students, and church. This cruise had been her husband's idea, a chance to celebrate their daughter's college graduation. Sharon had hesitated, worried about costs and crowds, but finally agreed. For her, this trip was meant to be a rare reward after years of steady work and sacrifice. She approached risk cautiously, rarely pushing boundaries. At school, she discouraged reckless behavior, and at home, she emphasized safety and order. Still, she placed trust in systems, assuming the cruise line, like any large institution, had measures in place to keep passengers secure. The tender system, which ferried passengers by smaller boats from anchored cruise ships to port, was foreign to her, but she accepted it as a standard practice. What she did not realize was that tendering consistently ranks among the riskiest operations on a cruise. Narrow aluminum gangways slick with spray, steep steps without handrails on one side, and constant vertical movement as the larger ship rose and fell against the much smaller boat. Even in calm seas, the 2 vessels rarely stayed aligned for more than a few seconds at a time. That morning, Sharon, her husband, and daughter waited on the embarkation deck in a long queue. Passengers jostled close together, many carrying bags or cameras. The gangway bridge connecting ship to tender dipped and lifted with each small swell, creating a brief window when a passenger could step safely. Crew members stood at either end, urging people forward the moment the platforms lined up. Sharon appeared tense, gripping the rail tightly. A woman behind her later recalled Sharon hesitating at the small but uneven step where metal ramp met the tender's open platform. Her family was only a few feet away when it happened. Sharon placed her foot forward, but the tender dropped half a foot lower just as she shifted her weight. Her sole skidded on the wet aluminum lip, and she lost balance. Her free hand reached for the crewman's arm but missed, and her body tipped sideways into the gap. She fell into the narrow strip of water between ship and tender. Crew shouted immediately, but the surge from the tender's engines was still active as it held position. The suction dragged her toward the stern before anyone could reach her. Witnesses saw her head surface briefly, her arms striking against the hull. Then, with the boat still maneuvering, its engines churned. Several passengers screamed as Sharon was pulled under, her body striking the propellers. The water foamed red almost instantly. Crew cut power within seconds, but the damage was done. Divers entered the water, recovering her body within minutes, but her injuries were described as catastrophic. Her husband and daughter were ushered away by staff, both in shock, while the remaining passengers waited in stunned silence. 3 days later, Sharon's body was flown home to Texas. Her funeral was small, attended by family, fellow teachers, and students. The school district offered counseling, and her church community provided support, but the loss was abrupt and disorienting. Mexican maritime authorities completed an investigation, concluding the incident was preventable. Recommendations included stationing additional crew at the tender entry, halting engine thrust while passengers boarded, and delaying transfer when the sea state caused excessive movement between vessels. It was August 29, 2018, aboard the Norwegian Escape as it crossed the Atlantic en route to Bermuda. The sun bore down on the ship's decks, the pools filled with families taking advantage of the calm sea. For one boy, what began as a routine swim would become a preventable tragedy. Lucas Rivera, 15, from Newark, New Jersey, was a strong swimmer. He had joined his high school swim team the year before and often pushed himself to stay underwater longer than his peers. His parents described him as competitive, curious, and restless, always eager to prove he could do what others found difficult. On the cruise, he gravitated toward the crowded main pool, insisting that even with younger children splashing around, he could still carve out space to dive and test his limits. His mother warned him to use the smaller, quieter pool toward the stern, but Lucas brushed it off. He wanted the challenge of the larger pool, where the depth and volume felt closer to the competitive settings he preferred. Cruise pools are designed with circulation systems that rely on suction drains to keep water filtered and clear. Though safety standards had been updated years earlier to reduce entrapment hazards, the escape system had not yet been refitted with newer protective covers, a detail unknown to most passengers. Unlike land-based public pools, cruise vessels often operate under a patchwork of international regulations, meaning older equipment can remain in service if not flagged during inspections. That afternoon, Lucas dove near the corner of the main pool, where one of the primary drains operated. His younger sister remembered watching him swim straight down, holding his breath, determined to stay under longer than before. Passengers nearby said they saw him pause at the bottom, then suddenly thrash. At first, it seemed like a playful movement, but within seconds, his arms shot out in desperate motions as his body pressed against the pool floor. Children screamed, alerting nearby adults. A man jumped in, trying to pull Lucas up, but the boy's torso was pinned flat by suction. His sister cried for help as more crew members rushed over. Witnesses later said the water around him quivered with turbulence from the intake, as if holding him down with invisible hands. His legs kicked violently, then slowed. Small clouds of blood appeared near his nose and mouth. Shouts filled the pool deck as crew scrambled to shut off the pump system. But unlike a home pool with a simple switch, the ship's system required crew to reach a locked maintenance panel below deck. The delay stretched into minutes. When the suction finally released, Lucas was hauled to the surface limp, his skin bluish. Crew members and a passenger nurse began CPR immediately on deck. For nearly 30 minutes, passengers, many in swimsuits dripping water, stood in silence as compressions and breaths were given. Children clutched parents as the scene stretched on. Despite the effort, Lucas never regained consciousness. Within a week, his funeral was held in Newark, drawing classmates, teachers, and neighbors who had watched him grow up. The Coast Guard's report cited improperly maintained suction fittings and delayed emergency response procedures as contributing factors. Norwegian quickly retrofitted its pools, but for his family, the changes came far too late. It was March 3rd, 2018, in the port of Miami. The sun was setting behind the city skyline as a cruise ship prepared to depart, its decks buzzing with last-minute checks and quiet urgency. Below, in the steel and fluorescent corridors reserved for crew, one task lingered unfinished. It was a routine maintenance job, but one that carried the potential for disaster. The man assigned to it was Reynaldo Cruz, a 32-year-old Filipino maintenance technician from Cebu. Reynaldo had worked at sea for nearly a decade, building a reputation among his colleagues as careful, dependable, and uncomplaining. His motivation was practical. He supported his wife and 2 young children back home, sending money each month to cover tuition and household expenses. He rarely drank, avoided conflict, and preferred the quiet rhythm of mechanical work. While not fearless, he accepted risk as part of his trade, trusting his training and years of experience in confined, hazardous spaces. The ship itself was outfitted with multiple service elevators, each critical to moving supplies, equipment, and crew across decks without disrupting passengers. These machines, while routine, demanded constant upkeep. Misaligned doors, frayed cables, or jammed sensors could halt operations. Reynaldo knew the systems well. He carried basic tools and followed procedures, but the elevators had been acting up in the days prior, one in particular jamming and alarming sporadically. Temporary fixes kept it running, but a permanent inspection had been delayed with departure looming. On that evening, Reynaldo was sent to address the fault before the ship cleared port. A few other crew members lingered nearby with cleaning carts, waiting for the elevator to be functional. One co-worker later recalled muttering that it should have been locked out of service until a full repair, but with departure underway, the pressure was to get it working. Reynaldo opened the control panel and attempted a manual reset. He moved quickly, focused, perhaps aware that supervisors were expecting the problem to be resolved before passengers noticed any disruption. The witnesses remembered what happened next. A metallic snap rang out, sharp and unnatural, followed by the grinding surge of the elevator car rising. Reynaldo, positioned in the doorway to adjust the mechanism, was caught between the moving lift and the deck frame. His torso was compressed first, ribs audibly cracking as his tools clattered to the floor. He screamed once, a raw, tearing sound, before the rising steel forced the air from his lungs. Co-workers slammed the call buttons and jammed a crowbar against the doors, but the machinery groaned on. Flesh and bone began to give way under the crushing weight, blood forcing through his shirt in sudden bursts. By the time the lift halted, his chest and abdomen were flattened against the frame, spine visibly bent and ruptured. The ship's infirmary staff could do nothing when they arrived. Reynaldo was pronounced dead in the narrow passageway, his remains left grotesquely pinned until the elevator could be powered down and pried open. Several of his colleagues vomited at the sight. Others stood in silence, unable to move. Reynaldo's body was flown home to Cebu days later. His wife received compensation from the cruise line, though no payment could account for the brutal manner of his death. The U.S. Coast Guard ordered immediate inspection of every elevator on board before the vessel was cleared for its next voyage. It was November 19, 2018, aboard the MSC Divina as it crossed the Caribbean Sea between St. Thomas and Puerto Rico. The evening air outside was warm and calm, but inside the ship's main theater, where over 1,000 passengers gathered for the nightly production show, a quiet chain of decisions was unfolding that would soon end in disaster. Mark Delaney, 38, was an electrician from Glasgow, Scotland. He had worked in residential wiring since his early 20s, building a reputation for being dependable, meticulous, and deeply curious about how things functioned. Outside of work, he held a strong fascination with stage productions, especially the technical elements, the lighting rigs, hydraulic lifts, and sound systems. This cruise, booked as an anniversary trip with his wife, combined both his need for rest and his interest in peeking behind the curtain of large-scale productions. He was known to chat with crew whenever possible, eager to learn how such systems compared to the ones he worked with at home. Mark's relationship to risk was subtle. In his electrical work, he followed rules strictly, but in leisure he often let curiosity overrule caution. On board, he had wandered backstage during intermissions and after shows, slipping briefly into restricted areas under the excuse of just looking. His wife often pulled him back, reminding him it wasn't his place, but Mark had a casual stubbornness when something piqued his interest. The theater's retractable stage fascinated him, massive hydraulic sections that could rise and sink seamlessly during performances. For Mark, it was not only a novelty but also a technical marvel he wanted to understand up close. That night's production had just ended. The lights dimmed, passengers were leaving, and the stage crew began the process of resetting equipment. Mark and his wife lingered near the side seating area, where a rope line marked the edge of the technical zone. One crew member later recalled him leaning over the rope, his eyes fixed on the machinery as the lift began to lower. His wife urged him to step back, pointing out the equipment was already in motion. But Mark had been drinking, and instead of moving away, he shifted closer, steadying himself with one hand on the rope barrier while peering into the narrowing gap. The danger was greater than he realized. The hydraulics were designed for smooth but powerful movement, with no tolerance for obstruction. The lift platform was retracting into its housing, creating a closing gap less than a foot wide. Mark lost his balance, whether from leaning too far, misjudging the rail, or the effects of alcohol. No one could say for certain. Witnesses in the first rows saw him stumble forward, chest first, into the opening. The moment of impact was immediate and brutal. As the lift continued downward, his torso was caught between steel and stage frame. A series of cracking sounds carried through the theater as ribs and vertebrae gave way under thousands of pounds of hydraulic pressure. His wife's scream cut through the stunned silence as blood appeared beneath the platform. Several passengers shouted for the machinery to stop, while stagehands scrambled to hit the emergency override. But even once halted, the damage was irreparable. Mark was motionless, pinned in place, his injuries catastrophic. Crew members ordered the theater cleared as medics rushed in, struggling to free him from the mechanism. Witnesses reported the crew working frantically, but the machinery, even reversed, moved too slowly to undo the crushing damage already inflicted. Within 40 minutes, ship medics confirmed he had died at the scene. His body was later removed discreetly under a sheet. Mark's widow returned to Glasgow within 2 weeks, accompanied by company staff. The funeral was small, but heavy with shock. Friends and co-workers struggling to reconcile the man they knew as careful with electricity, yet undone by a moment of preventable risk. Maritime investigators later cited inadequate safety barriers as a contributing factor, ordering all MSC vessels to increase perimeter protections around stage machinery. It was March 12, 2015, in the North Atlantic, midway through a storm-tossed crossing from New York to Southampton. The ship pressed forward through swells that shook its steel frame, each roll sending plates rattling in the dining halls and glasses clinking along the bars. Among the thousands on board, one woman made her way back to her cabin alone, unaware she was walking into the final moments of her life. Margaret Ellis, 74, was a retired nurse from Manchester. She had built her life around steady care for others, decades of ward work, and then later, volunteering at a hospice. Widowed, she traveled when she could, favoring cruises for their steady routines and opportunities to see places she had only read about. She was sociable but quiet, sharing dinners with a table of fellow British retirees. Her health was fair, her stride slightly cautious from a hip replacement, but she still managed long daily walks on the promenade deck, even in rough weather. For Margaret, risk had always been practical, never romantic. She was the sort of traveler who avoided excursions promising thrills, preferring lectures, reading lounges, and evenings of conversation. But the North Atlantic in March is unforgiving, and even the safest-seeming spaces carried dangers. Cruise ships rely on narrow stairwells that rise in stacked flights. In calm seas, they are routine passages. In heavy weather, they can become hazardous traps, with each lurch magnifying the force of a single misstep. That evening, the ship rocked harder than most passengers expected. Winds funneled across the decks, and waves struck broadside, rolling the vessel sharply from port to starboard. Crew urged caution, suggesting guests remain in cabins or use lifts rather than stairs. But elevators had grown crowded, and Margaret, not wanting to wait, declined her companion's offers to escort her. She left the dining hall early, telling them she wanted to lie down before the seas grew worse. Security footage later showed her entering the midship stairwell. She steadied herself on the first landing, pausing with her weight forward. The vessel lurched again just as she reached across to adjust the strap. Her grip broke, Her body swung sideways and her feet lost the steps beneath them. Witnesses on the lower deck saw her pitch forward, her temple glancing hard against the rail before her body folded awkwardly. She bounced off the edge of one stair, then another, striking steel with a series of dull thuds. She tumbled through the remaining flights, her arm twisting unnaturally beneath her before her head took the final impact. The stairwell froze, passengers staring at the body crumpled against the risers, her chest convulsing once before falling still. It took them a few seconds of silence and gasps before anyone called out for help. Crew medics arrived within minutes. They began compressions, fitting an oxygen mask, but the effort was mechanical. After prolonged attempts, the ship's doctor pronounced her dead. Her body was kept in the ship's morgue until arrival in Southampton, then flown to Manchester. Her children arranged a small funeral with close family and neighbors. The cruise line offered condolences and quietly introduced stricter protocols, staff reminders for elderly passengers, improved lighting, and more visible caution signage. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed these stories of tragedy sprouting out of nowhere, click here for more.